Well, good morning still. For those of you on the working breakfasts at 8 a.m. this morning, this is now what's called deep morning. This is a long morning, but still we're in the morning. I want to welcome all of you to this session, Can Democracy Deliver, with the rather Trumpish subtitle, How to Make Liberal Democracy Great Again. And what I want to do is to sort of tell you briefly about how we thought we'd structure this this session, and then I'll introduce our three marvelous panelists, and then we'll jump right into it. So, in essence, I think what we want to do this morning is to cover three questions, three things, okay, and to sort of do it in sort of broadly sequential form, okay. So, I think in order for us to answer this question, can democracy deliver, we should first ask the question, what should democracy deliver, right? What is it that we're trying to preserve? What is it that we are trying to defend? What's so great about liberal democracy? And just as importantly, given the tectonic changes that are happening in the world, given this new era of anxiety, this new age of great transformations, technological, geopolitical, scientific, demographic, what should we absolutely preserve about liberal order and democracy, but also what can we let go of, right? Because many of our institutions and our practices are 19th century and perhaps even 18th century practices. So what is democracy supposed to deliver? That's going to be theme number one. Theme number two, what went wrong? Now, there are different theories floating out there. Some of them are focused on economics, globalization, inequality, the haves and the have-nots. Some of them are focused on this mysterious, amorphous concept of identity. What we have is a crisis of identity, but what does that really mean? I've already mentioned the word anxiety, or the new age of anxiety. Is this what is eroding and fraying our liberal order at the national and regional and international level? What went wrong? And finally, how do we fix it? What do we do about it? Can liberal democracy be made great again? And if so, what will it take? Again, if we look at the debate internationally about this, there are different theories about this. There are books coming out now, just beginning to come out, with titles such as Renovating Democracy. Do we need to renovate democracy? And if so, what does that renovation look like, right? We can think about the three R's. Is democracy in need of renovation? So we keep the foundations and the supporting walls of the house, but we somehow make it into a 21st century energy-efficient smart house, right? That would be the sort of analogy. The second R would be reform. We have to reform democracy institutionally and in terms of procedures. We see this debate around representative democracy versus direct democracy, right? And then the third R would be revolutionize democracy. And here we would think, well, just as in the 17th century and later on in the 19th century, we went into this period of rapid cultural, economic, technological change, we emerge with a new social contract, and really we emerge with a new species of democracy, right? The Hobbesian arrangement was succeeded by a sort of million Knights Watchmen state, minimalist democracy, delivering few public goods, leaving a lot of space for the free market, and so on and so forth. And then after the tumultuous first part of the 20th century, we've had the birth of the welfare state. So maybe the new social contract that we're going to see, the new type of statehood that we're going to see, democratic statehood, hopefully, that we're going to see in the 21st century, is going to be some kind of new social contract, some kind of new understanding of democracy. So how do we fix it? Then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. And as the moderator, I also have the obligation to, at the very end, come up with three deliverables, three takeaway issues that we're supposed to sort of sum up the discussion. So without further ado, let's start with this question of what is democracy supposed to deliver. Let me just very briefly, very briefly introduce our three panelists. We'll start with Dr. Richard Youngs, Professor Richard Youngs, who's a senior fellow in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at Carnegie Europe. He's also still a professor at Warwick in the United Kingdom. A good friend, Richard. Then we will hear from Carolina Vigura, who's a sociologist, a journalist, and a member of the board of Kultura Liberalna, the Kultura Liberalna Foundation in Poland. And then, of course, last but not least, Ralf Fuchs, the president of the Center for Liberal Modernity in Germany. So perhaps, Richard, I could start with you. What is democracy supposed to deliver? And what's so great about liberal democracy?
I think for me the kind of non-negotiable core would be that citizens should feel meaningful participation over public decision-making. I think in your terms, what democracy needs is a degree of regeneration or renewal, but I think a lot of this renewal is already beginning to happen. For me, the starting point would be that there's no single, dramatic, uniform template for making democracy great again. I'm not sure I would frame the challenge in those terms. It seems to me that the situation regarding democracy is very different across different countries and regions of the world. In some countries, clearly the crisis is very grave. In other countries, democracy is doing reasonably well and even registering modest improvements. It strikes me, I think if you look across the world, even within Europe itself, in a way we're kind of facing two almost diametrically opposed different problems with democracy. One is the phenomenon of states kind of sucking out the oxygen from democratic pluralism. But on the other hand, there's a problem of, in some countries, pluralism being kind of so chaotic that it's affecting governability, that coalitions and alliances now seem to be more difficult to form. So, even within single countries, those two problems can often coexist. But in different kinds of combinations. So it seems to me what is going wrong with democracy is different across different countries, and what is needed to fix it, if we frame it in those terms, is also very different. I think perhaps one way we can progress the debate a bit is to get away from the focus on populism. I know many people in the room work extensively on this issue, but it seems to me the relationship between different variants of populism and democratic quality is actually quite complex. I mean, some of the democracy indices in Europe show that for all the justifiable worry about populism, in fact, most of the democratic decline is coming about not at the behest of populists, but at the behest of executives kind of closing democratic space. So those have been my opening remarks. I think this means that there's no kind of easy solution. Many people would argue that democracies just need to deliver a bit better on the economic front, then popular legitimacy will return to democracy. I'm a bit more skeptical of that argument, and it seems a bit more complex to me. It seems there's no easy silver bullet or panacea. We just need a kind of very long, undramatic, painstaking process of replenishing the quality of democratic process, and that needs to be done at many different levels. Some of it is about improving this wave of participative assemblies that's spreading across Europe and the world. These show great potential, but haven't yet really contributed to reviving democracy in any kind of macro-political sense. Then there's debates about how we use local level referendums. These are actually increasing across the world at the moment, but can have positive or negative effects. There's all the democratic energy that's caught up in protests. We're living in an era of unprecedented intensity of large-scale protests across the world, but I think we all know that often these are not harnessed as smoothly as they could be for long-term democratic regeneration. So there's a lot happening. I can go into more detail of different kinds of solutions. I don't think there is one template. I think a lot of small steps have got to be implemented at a lot of different levels, reflecting a lot of different types of democratic dynamics in order to meet this agenda of democratic regeneration or renovation that you talk about.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Carolina, what is democracy supposed to deliver? Let's start with that. Let's try to have a sense of what is it that we're trying to preserve and what is it that we can let go of.
Good that you are asking this, because I am kept asked today about the result of Polish elections. We can come to that later, but I actually wanted, answering your question, I wanted actually to start with another elections that were in 1990. This is the year when we in Poland organized the first fully free presidential elections, and I was 10. And I believe it's important because democracy and liberal democracy in Poland has very much this generational aspect. And I remember myself on the 25th of November 1990 very, very precisely, because I remember what I was doing. I was jumping. I was jumping with joy because Lech Wałęsa has won. This tells you a lot about how politicized and how democratically aware my generation was. And what did we believe, actually? What did we believe that it would deliver? Well, I think for the first 25 years after 1989 and 1990, we believed that democracy would deliver us the West. We wanted to imitate the West because we thought that this would bring us the same quality of living. So we imitated. And we had this particular mythos of the West. We have been writing about it extensively in Kultura Liberalna, the mythos of the West that meant that everything that came from the West was good. Everything. Whether it was American films, or liberal order, rule of law, constitutionalism, it all seemed so great. So in the middle of this crisis that we have now, on the local level, is the question, okay, after the mythos of the West have evaporated for many, many reasons, for generational reasons, for the reason that we are already in the West and now we are simply comparing ourselves with the rest of it, etc. What actually is the thing that we could focus on if the mythos of the West has evaporated? And I must say, perhaps this question and the fact that the liberal elites in Poland were completely lost as for the answer is the reason for which today we know already that Law and Justice has won for the second time. Because the liberals simply do not know what liberal democracy is to deliver. And now to finally answer your question. There is a beautiful essay by George Orwell, which is called Democracy and Fascism. And George Orwell, in this essay, compares democracy with fascism. And he says, well, there are people who are criticizing democracy, saying, well, in democracy you have corruption. You can be arrested with no reason. You have many, many flaws in democracy. And he says, yes, democracy is not flawless, but it delivers something which has no price, which is priceless. It delivers quality of life. Certain quality which brings the different from fascism, from illiberal democracy, we would say, from any other autocratic regime. Where does the quality lie? Democracy brings more justice, more pluralism, more stability, and more individual freedom. It's not that it brings an ideal world as we in Central and Eastern Europe believed. This belief will not come back, to se ne vrati. But we can still remember about Orwell, about the quality that is brought by democracy.
Okay. Ralph, what's so great about liberal democracy? Why should we?
I would like to go. I would like to go back to the very basics. For me, liberal democracy up to now is the best political order humankind invented to protect human dignity. This, in my view, is the core of everything. And if you're reading, I strongly recommend to do it, the basic texts, the basic manifestations of democratic self-government and human rights in our modern history, the American Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of Citizens and Human Rights in the French Revolution in 1789. The latter one starts with the sentence, every human being is entitled with equal rights of freedom, security, property, and the right to resistance against tyranny. I think still today, for me, this is a very, very compelling message. So we have no grand formula, no one fits for all this definition of liberal democracy, but we all know the elements of it. The combination of individual liberty, the right of self-determination, to live the life you want to live. The rule of law, very important. There is no sustainable liberty without rule of law. The division of powers, limiting the power of the state, equal opportunities, cultural diversity. This is the mix we stick to and we have to defend. And looking back to the last century, for me, this is the final reassurance against barbarism, which always is an option in our political and societal life. And if you're looking today to Syria, if you have been looking to the post-Yugoslav civil war in the early 90s, to Rwanda, it's always, the potential of barbarism is always there. And to protect us against this, I think this concept of liberal democracy is the reassurance of last resort. But at the same time, and I think this strive for liberty is very deeply rooted in our nature as human beings. And it never ends. Yeah? And if you're looking to the ongoing Hong Kong now, or some month ago, Sudan or Algeria, you can even take the last night's election in Budapest. There is an ongoing, I would say, aspiration for freedom and democracy all over the world. It's not a Western exclusive pattern. Don't believe in the narrative that human rights are only a kind of Western invention. No, this is a universalist value. But at the same time, the aspiration for freedom is competing with other basic aspirations in human life, especially with security and, to a certain degree, social justice / equality, and the tension. I think this is the basic challenge we are facing today, to balance the tension between liberty and security and social inclusion, social justice, social participation.
I think one of the axioms of liberalism, certainly in the last few decades, was that democracy didn't have to actively deliver because it was somehow inherently superior, right? But I want us to focus on this question of the need to deliver. Have we been complacent? Have we been neglectful in assuming that democracy is inherently superior? That it didn't really have to deliver or prove day after day that it is the best form of government, because this was kind of assumed. And when did this change? Are we now in a new era of contestation? Do we need to once again contest and demonstrate that it will be Western, liberal, open societies that will take the lead in terms of military power, technological advantage? Because for the first time we have, for some time, we have challenges. We have authoritarian challenges who are offering a different vision of human life, a different vision of human good, and a different model that challenges democracy as the basic form of government. What do we need to deliver to win this new contestation? Richard, you want to start with that?
Have we been complacent? Probably yes. Does democracy need to deliver better? Yes. But I think one slight challenge is that question is often reduced to the question of democracy needing to deliver more on economic growth or economic justice, and which are clearly desirable ends in themselves. But from everything I understand, the relationship between economic justice, economic growth, and democratic quality is actually very, very complicated. So if we reduce this question to democracy delivering, to this question of is democracy inherently superior in delivering economic outputs, then we're probably fighting on slightly fragile ground, because there are either less liberal forms of democracy or non-democratic regimes that are performing as well in terms of economic output. So it seems to me the nub is how we define delivering. And I return to my initial point that democracy's promise is one of kind of emancipation in terms of people's preferences being translated into meaningful policy outputs. And if democracy isn't delivering on that score, then I think it will struggle to regain legitimacy. And if it's failing on that, it's because despite all this kind of very formal edifice of liberal rights and protections, we all know there are still many different layers of vested interests that act as kind of obstacles between people's preferences and policy outputs. So coming back to the practical question of how democracy needs to be regenerated, it seems to me that in the future there needs to be much more debate about different variations of democracy, different, maybe not wholesale models of democracy, but certainly different forms and strands of democracy that can return us more to this more kind of rights-based potential of liberal democracy.
Carolina, when you think about the question, what does democracy have to deliver? What is it that it needs to deliver? Is it identity? Is it belonging? Is it attachment? Is it a certain protected sphere into which the government does not interfere? Or is it physical security, a sense of well-being? What is it that this order has to deliver in order to survive and to thrive?
But are you asking about liberal democracy, or are you asking about democracy as such? Because, you know, Law and Justice has just democratized us.
Yeah.
Do you know that the actual participation in the elections has been 10% bigger yesterday than 4 years ago? We have been democratized. We have for 25 years, and as I told you, my political initiation was very early. For 25 years, we haven't been speaking about democracy so much at such length as today. So perhaps we should rather talk about liberal democracy and not democracy as such, because I do believe we do have democracy in Poland. It has not ceased to be. It's there. It is different, though. And it would be perhaps good to remember that liberal democracy, as we knew it before 2015, before 2016, it's not there anymore, and it will not come back. So, if you are asking me what is this thing that liberal democracy delivers, then I would say, well, it's a whole spectrum of things, But if we are to revitalize the liberal democracy, it will probably deliver slightly different things than before.
Carolina, would you say there is such thing as an illiberal democracy?
This is an oxymoron.
Yeah.
This is an oxymoron.
Obviously.
But I do like the Yascha Mounk's argument that there is an undemocratic liberalism. I like it very much because it actually gets right into the center of our discussion, namely how much power the citizens feel that they have. And when I say that Law and Justice democratized us, then I say that when people went to the ballot box yesterday, they actually believed that their votes are being counted and they're being taken seriously. So, this would be also very important, that the liberal democracy that we created, we as Europeans, after 1945, was actually a liberal democracy which was not very democratic as for what people, how much people had to say and how much they could understood and how much they were meant to understand. You know, there is this book by Francis Fukuyama, a very famous one, yes, The End of History and the Last Man. And sometimes when I think about how the European Union became during the decades and decades of its existence, I would say I would rephrase this title, and I would say the title that would actually tell what the European Union looks like today would be The End of the European Union and the Last Lawyer. Meaning that the European Union and this undemocratic liberalism have become so full of labyrinths of corridors, procedures. Of course very wise, of course very needed, but without space for the citizens themselves.
Yeah. Richard, you have you've written a book called Europe Reset recently, where you really highly recommended book, where you really sort of delve into this issue of the democratic deficit. And of course, we have a panel here. I want to acknowledge this with my own exception. Everybody here comes from a European Union member state. Richard, you're still a European. The UK is still a European member state. Maybe not for long. But it does raise this very interesting question of what does it mean for democracy to deliver in a member state of the European Union versus the United States or Canada or Israel, Australia. It's very, very different. We have a sort of a multi-level governance system here and a long-term debate about the democratic deficit of the EU. This should lead us to sort of a discussion of the 3 R's: reform, renovation, revolution. And in your book, Richard, Europe Reset, you develop some very interesting ideas about how to re-energize, repoliticize, but also in a more deep way to democratize the European Union. Perhaps this could be a good segue for a discussion of sort of where do we go from here?
Hey.
I'll answer that, but if just one word on this relationship between democracy and liberalism, which is really, really complicated, and I think it's absolutely vital to the future of democracy and whether we are capable of reviving democracy and whether democracy delivers. There is this line that's taken root that either we have democracy or we have liberalism, because these are pulling so far apart that they're almost analyzed as being mutually exclusive. Personally, I'm not sure I buy this argument. It seems much more complicated than that. So if you look at the correlations, most of the countries that are doing bad on democracy are also doing bad on liberalism and liberal rights. So it doesn't, this idea that there's a kind of choice to be made, a diametrically opposed choice between democracy and liberalism, doesn't quite fit with the facts to me. And the trouble is that democracies might need to leave room for non-liberal policy choices, but it seems to me these non-liberal kind of identities and policy issues are being used as a way of undertaking core liberal rights which are needed to make democracy function at all in any kind of proper sense. So there's an overlap between liberalism and democracy, and you need a core of liberalism for democracy to have any sense at all. So for me, this argument that either we have democratic illiberalism or undemocratic liberalism is actually very dangerous when we come to debate the future of democracy. On the EU, I think we all know that there's a kind of specificity in Europe that we cannot hope to regenerate democracy only through measures at the national level, because so many important issues are taken at the European level, that if EU-level decision-making isn't opened up and made more accountable and participative, then no amount of effort at the national or even the sub-national effort is going to make any effort. I know there's very eminent people in the audience who've been writing on the democratic deficit for many years. It's an old problem, and European policymakers have been promising for more than 2 decades to democratize the EU level. So there's a lot to say there. It hasn't really improved because of the economic crisis. This disconnect between citizens and EU decision-making has actually worsened in recent years. That has depleted democratic quality within nation states. There's a lot to say on that. Just suffice it to say here that this is now on the EU agenda, I think, because the selection of leadership at the EU level this time round was handled in such an opaque way that something has to be done. There are lots of initiatives now at the European level to try different forms of direct or participative democracy, recognizing what you can't do is hope to replicate the institutional structures of the nation state at the EU level. So the EU needs to be democratized, but it needs to be democratized in a different way from the kind of debates we're talking about at the national level. The new Commission is promising a whole convention and a whole action plan on democratizing the EU. So one would think that the pressure is so strong now, because of what's happening in Poland and Hungary, but also in other countries as well, that something needs to move this time around. But as I say, it's an old issue, and this has been promised so many times that one thinks, what is actually needed for something to actually happen, rather than simply empty promises made at the EU level.
Thank you, Ralph. Your comments, please. And Ralph, and then we open it up.
First, a brief remark on liberalism and democracy. I agree widely with what have been said by Carolina and Richard, but I would like to remember you that today's populist and authoritarian movements, I would say they are not explicitly anti-democratic. Mm-hmm. They are explicitly anti-liberal. And this goes back to the 20s of the last century. If you, for instance, are looking to a political thinker like Carl Schmitt, he explicitly tried to separate democracy and liberalism. And his declared enemy was liberalism. And he even went so far to say that even fascism and communism could be democratic, because this is government for the people. And the kind of unity between the people and the leadership, the immediate unity between people and leadership. So let's not be foolish. I would totally agree that without these basic liberal rights, democracy will vanish, will erode. So we have to defend the concept of liberal democracy, and this is very different from an idea of the winner takes it all democracy. Yeah, that democracy would only about the rule of the majority. So, but back to your question, what should democracy or what has democracy to deliver? I will focus on 3 areas. The first one is we have to remember that democracy from the beginning was very much about the public good. And I think we neglected the importance of the public good over the last decades a little bit. What do I mean with public good? For instance, basic social security, very important in times of turbulent economic and technological change. Very important. Let's not contradict security and liberty, social security and liberty. Social security, to a certain extent, is the precondition to act your right to liberty, yeah, of self-determination. You have to have a kind of basic social security. Basically, it's about freedom from fear. Freedom from fear. This is the elementary freedom. And this includes the kind of collective reassurance against the risk of then modernity. The second one is public education, of course, extremely important. Public infrastructure, healthcare, public transport, all these are public goods. You can even say these are republican institutions, and we have to invest much more attention and much more money in these public goods. And the last point, liberalism traditionally is about limiting government, limiting the power of government. But now the challenge to liberalism is limiting the power of markets. We have to restate political sovereignty over capitalism, over the markets, not to abolish them, but to make them work. Yeah, and if you're looking back to the financial crisis of 2008, this, in my view, is the mother of all crises. So we have to re-embed the markets into a kind of democratic framework which gives people a say. If we don't, then unfettered globalization and unfettered capitalism will eat up democracy.
So what I'm hearing from our panelists, at the heart of the liberal democratic idea, and that theme, that relationship has come, at the heart of this is human flourishing. You say, Ralph, freedom from fear. Yesterday we had a workshop on a similar theme, and Jan Zielonka, who I see here in the room, used the term empowerment, empowerment of human beings. At the heart of the democratic liberal order lies the idea of the sovereign and responsible individual. And if we think about it, the history of modernity is trying to find solution structures, typically in the form of the state, that will provide freedom from fear. So in the 17th century, it was, how do we get out of the religious wars that devastated Europe, and we create order out of chaos to provide basic human security. In the 18th century, it was about constitutionalism and about rights, ideas of rights and the rule of law. And in the 20th century, it was about the welfare state, social, political rights. So when we ask the question, what does liberal order look like in the 21st century, we should once again ask ourselves, what will be the set of arrangements, whether they're local or national or regional or global, that will produce maximum human flourishing, security, well-being, meaning, identity, a sense of well-being. And this may look very different given the great disruptions, the great transformations that we are facing. This may actually, and it's likely to look very different in 30 or 40 or 50 years' time than it does today. With that thought, I want to open it up. Please identify yourself. Please be succinct, and please try to stick to the main theme of the panel of can democracy deliver. I see a great gender imbalance in the hands in the room, so I'd like to encourage more ladies to raise their hands as well. But I'll start with you, sir, over here, because I saw you first. Please, just introduce yourself briefly.
Sure, I'm Mike Gonzalez from the Heritage Foundation in Washington.
Yeah.
Fantastic panel. Thank you very much. In my country, the debate is not over democracy. It's a real debate over liberalism.
Yeah.
And by that, I don't mean the liberalism of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. I mean the liberalism of law. And they say that it's not, we don't put it on Hobbes, we put it on Locke. They say by rendering the individual sovereign, we made them very unhappy. You said that, making the argument that liberalism has not delivered quality of life. Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame, Oren Cass, Yoram Hazony. I agree with you. I like liberalism. I like you enumerated natural rights when you know earlier before, but people are saying these natural rights that Locke in the Anglo-Scots got it wrong by placing them on the individual. Right. They got it wrong by making the individual sovereign and giving the rights to the individual. They forgot family and community. So there's kind of a return to Burke. I think these people need a response. These are serious people making serious arguments. I like liberal democracy. I agree with you that they're universal, but how do we respond to them in a way that actually addresses what they're saying?
Maybe this is a good one for Carolina, if you would like to address that.
Let me just address it.
Yeah, let me just take a couple more, and then we'll. Okay. Gia, please, Gia Nodia, and then Sir, I will come to you. I saw your hand, and I'll come to you.
Hi. So I think people spoke quite eloquently and rightly. I think that liberal democracy is a inherently controversial concept because you can have anti-liberal people behave democratically for some time, but ultimately liberal democracy is unsustainable because the very possibility of changing government through elections requires some liberal freedoms, right? But what about sustainability or unsustainability of undemocratic liberalism? We had undemocratic liberalism like in most of 19th century was Western Europe was undemocratic liberalism. So what do you think about these dialectics, let's say, of sustainability of undemocratic liberalism?
Richard, maybe you can address that. Sir, question, then we'll take answers from the panel.
My name is John Vlasto from Democracy Without Borders. I've come here from the Athens Democracy Forum, and this morning I've heard a great deal about the problems of national democracy. I'd like to put to the panel that perhaps the problem tying into the issue of regaining control of the markets is that we don't consider the global level. The lack of thought of democratizing governance at the global level is what is creating the problems for democracy at the national level, on the markets, on sustainability, and so on.
Thank you. Maybe Ralph, that's one that you would want to address. So let's start with Carolina, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. I wanted to address what you have been saying, Amichai, about the particular centuries and how we can generalize about those centuries. I found a beautiful quotation from Albert Camus, who wrote, "The 17th century was an age of mathematicians, the 18th century of the physical science, the 19th century was an age of biology, and the 20th century is an age of fear." So you have all those sciences, and then the product is fear, a passion. And I think that we have not enough spoken of passions today. If I were to say what is the dominant emotion or passion of the 21st century, I would say it's the feeling of loss. People who come, like me, from Central and Eastern Europe and have observed democratic transformation know how much an ambivalent process this is. On one hand, there is this spectacular success, an economic success, institutional success. On the other hand, there is this tremendous loss of relationships, loss of language. Many people today in Poland, and I believe this is not only a Polish phenomenon, who are 40 or 30 or 20, are actually unable to communicate on a deeper level with their parents because their experience is so much different. And I think it really goes not only about Poland, it goes also about the consequences of development, also in a more broader global context. the feeling of loss actually is not only on the side of the societies that underwent a deep technological but also democratic institutional transformation. It is also, and I would like to underline it here, it is also on the side of liberal elites themselves. This year in June, I was in the European, in the Solidarity Center in Gdańsk, when there was a big celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Republic, of course organized by the liberal elites without merging with the other conservative nationalist elite. It was the most sad celebration I have ever seen, because it was felt with the sadness, with the feeling of loss. We have lost something, said Agnieszka Holland when I asked her, and we still don't understand why we lost it. So I'm saying that to also underline that this all has a very generational aspect. I must say, I was struck by this today. You know, perhaps we should really stop criticizing liberalism. It's really a great ideology. It brings a great quality of life. The only thing that we should do is we should remember that liberalism and liberal democracy, the meaning of them that prevails is still the meaning that was given to them a few decades ago, and perhaps we should simply think about a new formulation of liberalism and liberal democracy. We should define it anew and not say, well, liberalism went wrong, this all went wrong. You know, it's we should start somewhere else. We should understand that the generations that actually created liberalism and liberal democracy after the Second World War were wonderful generations. They have had their beautiful success, but they are also only people. And that's why we should rather think about how we can formulate liberalism and liberal democracy for the future.
Richard, undemocratic liberalism.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this whole issue of non-individual rights is absolutely key to these debates. I mean, Jan has written on this as well. And I think this is a core issue of political philosophy for more than 200 years, and it is amazing how much it's come back to the fore. I mean, again, there's a lot to be said on it. My concern would be that these justifiable concerns over community, family, tradition, religion, etc., are being used as a kind of pretext to attack liberal rights that are actually should be non-negotiable core to the way that democracy works. So we're kind of crossing, many regimes seem to be crossing the line between non-liberal policies and non-liberal structural elements of a political system. I think that's, for me, that's where the concern arises. And then the other side of the coin, as I said, I think this concept of undemocratic liberalism is maybe a little bit overstated, but I do think the practical implication is that more areas of policy need to be opened up for more open-ended democratic debate, rather than kind of liberal elements being protected outside the sphere of democratic debate. But for me, the practical question is then how do we actually do that? And sorry to keep coming back to these. I mean, these are big questions of political philosophy, but for me, the more mundane questions is what areas of democratic renewal are actually taking place, and what potential do they have, and how can we make them work? So there's a whole range of experimentation going on in more direct forms of democratic representation and accountability, and that's what the argument of people who say that democracy should be more direct democracy, and that would lead us in a less liberal direction. That's where experts have been debating for several years now, how you have more direct forms of democracy that do not threaten these core liberal rights, that you do offer citizens more of a direct input to policy making, but in a way that doesn't tip over into illiberal majoritarianism, that kind of protects citizens in terms of their key liberal rights, but at the same time gives them more direct say over some decisions.
Yeah.
Ralph.
Maybe just one thought on this kind of undemocratic liberalism. For me, the core of this concept, and this was also if you would use the term for the 19th century in Europe, this is the separation of capitalism and liberal democracy. So you have kind of free markets, deregulated economy, and authoritarian rule. And this is the new challenge. If you maybe in the early 19th we could have the illusion that the globalization of capitalism would lead to the globalization of democracy. Now we know this is not the case. And we are back to a systemic competition between the combination of liberal democracy and market economies / capitalism and kind of authoritarian capitalism. China, Russia, and their promise is prosperity and social upward mobility without democracy. This is their promise, and this is the challenge to liberal democracies, and this is the challenge on the output legitimacy of democracies. We have to deliver a certain degree of social security and prosperity in competition to the authoritarian regimes. And this also relates to your question of we have to think out of the national box if we are talking about democratic regulation of the economy, of the governance. And this is now today a very complex and complicated challenge because we have to cooperate with the authoritarian regimes, looking for common rules and institutions for the global economy, including climate and basic social rights globally. And at the same time, we are in conflict with them. And how to balance this tension between global cooperation, also with our adversaries, and conflict, being serious that they are really challenging our way of life and our political systems. I think this has to be thought much deeper. At first, of course, we can say we have to defend the liberal international order as far as possible, a rule-based international order, and not only just a power-based international order. But this is easy to say and hard to do if, for instance, the US, which has been the guarantor of the global liberal order up to now, is walking away from it. We will face very, very difficult times. So the next American presidential elections, this will be global elections. I would like to have a vote in it.
We have time for 2 additional brief questions. I saw you, sir. Again, we've had no... I want to give some... Okay, it's only guys who are putting their hands up. Okay, no. Lady over there.
In the back.
Oh, okay. And then I need a couple of minutes to sum up, and then I'll do something very un-Israeli, which is to finish on time. Sir.
My name is Nahid. I'm from Azerbaijan. I'm one of the staff members of the Wake Up political movement trying to actually fighting for democracy in Azerbaijan. So today we face kind of a waves of authoritarianism in the world. And we also see that actually the reports on corruptions, Laundromat reports, reveal so many names of politicians from very European countries, including Germany, Italy. And also today we see that so many companies based in Western Europe run their business in authoritarian regimes. Also today we see that Trump just picks up the phone and calls the democratically elected Ukrainian president, tries to push him into the corner. So my question is it correct to say that one of the reasons behind the spread of authoritarianism is the fatigue in liberal democracy? Or is it possible to say that the democratic countries or the politicians in democratic countries find a way how to exploit authoritarian regimes and further became kind of a supporter or the preserver of these regimes.
Thank you. Thank you. Ma'am. Yes, please, ma'am.
Okay, Linda Stutz-Bartova, I come from Prague. I'm 1989 generation. And I'd like to go back to your point, what should we let go of? Because it seems to me that the expectations nowadays are just so high that basically we are doomed to fail. Okay? We started with our expectations in 1989, talking about what we expected on the level of state. Now we ended up what we expect on the level of individual. Is it realistic?
Thank you. Who on the panel would like to touch? Richard, please.
Well, I'll just touch on this issue that really takes us into a different sphere of international democracy policies. Just by coincidence, actually, this morning the EU foreign ministers are signing a new EU democracy strategy, which basically reflects democracy support strategy, which basically reflects that things have moved in the direction you describe, away from any really assertive or particularly committed attempt to support democratic reforms in the world because of geopolitical considerations. That's probably not the driving causal force of democratic problems around the world, but it is one factor. But I think your observations also remind us that we've perhaps got into being a little bit Eurocentric here in talking about these debates about illiberal democracy, when in many countries there's just a fight for basic democratic rights, and that political trends are going in completely the opposite direction. And probably, although the EU now portrays itself as the kind of last defender of the liberal order, probably most European governments are still doing more to foster authoritarianism than they are doing to foster democracy. So what one hopes maybe now with a new strategy that will begin to change. But it's a bit like these endless debates about democratizing the EU itself, with their kind of years of promises, and then they don't really translate into anything in terms of concrete policies.
Carolina, briefly, and then I'll sum up.
Yeah, listen, I just wanted to add that there is one more elephant in the room we have not mentioned in our short panel, and the name of the elephant is communication. We have been talking here about agenda, about how to recreate liberal democracy, how to diagnose what went wrong. But in fact, when you look at the elections results, you see that it's not enough to be right. We may be right, but it's really not enough to be right. And when you look at the successes of the liberal mayors in various cities, like Mr. Trzaskowski in Warsaw, or Mr. Karacsony in Budapest, or Imamoglu in Istanbul, then you see that those are people who are not only they are convinced that they are right, but they are actually able to communicate, to connect with the electorate. They simply go and they try to explain what they believe to each and every person. So we should really reflect on that.
Thank you. 4 takeaway points for the rapporteurs that I'd like to highlight. We speak a lot about the fog of war and the fog of history. I think we're at this historical moment where we can talk about the fog of the contemporary. We understand that our reality has fundamentally changed, and that we are in the midst of a great transformation, a set of transformations that's producing a lot of anxiety. It's questioning the existing order that we're all born into, and we kind of take it for granted. We experience a sense of loss, and we are seeking a new balance, a new equilibrium, but we don't quite know what it is, and it's likely that it will take years and possibly decades to find it. This has certainly been the historical experience. That was point number 1. Point number 2, about the relationship between democracy and liberalism. I think I was going to formulate this as follows. When we talk about democracy, what we really mean is the democratic rule of law, market-based welfare state nestled within a liberal international order. That's a big package that sort of came together in the aftermath of the First and the Second World War. That package is now fraying, it is now untangling, and it's untangling to different degrees and in different ways in different parts of the world. The crisis of democracy in the Middle East or parts of Africa or even Latin America is a crisis of statehood, not elections. The crisis of democracy in Europe, in many respects, is not a crisis of elections or even electoral participation, as we saw from Poland just yesterday. It's a crisis of liberalism and the rule of law. So the package is unraveling in different ways in different places. To deliver, when we say what does democracy have to deliver, we need to disaggregate that into different levels. Democracy needs to deliver on an individual level, of attachment, of meaning, of belonging, of autonomy, of responsibility. It needs to deliver on the national level. It needs to deliver in terms of regional governance. But we also have to think about the new order contestation and how we renew a liberal international order that has undergirded liberal modernity. If you think about it, we are now at a unique moment in modern history where we do not have a liberal hegemon underwriting the entire system, the liberal project. We first had Great Britain, the British Empire, served that role in the 19th century, then the United States took over. But we no longer have that guarantee. What does democracy look like in a world where we do not have a liberal global power underwriting the entire system? We just don't know, okay? And lastly, a point that Ralph has emphasized, we must not assume that democracy is inherently, normatively, or empirically superior. We all like to believe that that is the case. And I happen to believe normatively that it is the case, that liberal democracy is inherently superior. But working on the basis of that assumption will breed complacency and laziness. We have to be able to contest again. We need to understand that we are in a new era of order contestation. And unless we generate winning liberal solutions to the great challenges of our age, environment, technology, demography, genetics, and so on and so forth, we are going to lose to alternative rising competitors, in particular China. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and thank you for your wonderful participation.